On the morning of June 14th, 1786, Captain James Moore's family woke up on what seemed to be a normal day in Southwest Virginia. But as they left the family's cabin to tend to their farm animals, the fearful war whoop was heard, and a raiding party of Ohio Valley Shawnee Indians rode down a ridgeline and attacked them. Captain Moore was shot 7 times before being tomahawked and scalped. The Indians then murdered 3 of his children, leaving only his family members who were locked inside the cabin. Much like the Barbary pirates, the Indians broke into the house, shot the dogs, plundered and burned the home, killed the livestock, and took Moore's wife and surviving children captive. The raiding party stole horses and embarked on a journey to Detroit, which was then an open-air market for humans captured by Indians. To give you a sense of the savagery of the Indians, when one of the surviving sons, John, fell behind on the journey, an Indian split his head open with a tomahawk and then told John's mother what happened with her son's bloody scalp hanging in his waistband. They reached Detroit in December, where, in a drunken frolic, one of the surviving daughters, Mary Moore, was sold into slavery for a few gallons of rum to a man named Stogwell, who had been an active Tory during the war and had removed to Canada after it closed for fear of losing his life if he remained in the United States. 3 years later, she was rescued by her brother and returned to the United States. Stories like Mary Moore's were common in the early frontier period in America, and often the stories became nationwide bestsellers. The vast majority of white slaves in the United States were owned by fellow whites. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of white immigrants to the American colonies arrived in bondage, often involuntarily. An estimated 350,000 arrived between 1620 and 1776, in numbers that likely far exceeded the number of black slaves who arrived in the 1600s. Mortality rates on the journey to the colonies often exceeded 20%. Many of them were legally classified as indentured servants under British law. Indentured servitude was, in theory, a contract entered between a poor person and a sponsor, in which the sponsor pays for the poor person's transit across the Atlantic in exchange for a set period of bondage. That, however, is the textbook definition. Reality was much harsher. In the early colonial period, there were not substantial differences between indentured servants and black slaves. Many were subjected to conditions of such brutality, duration, and heritability that historians increasingly regard slave as the more accurate term. There's no question that indentured servitude was slavery. Some indenture contracts literally use the term slave, and ads issued for runaway servants asked for them to be returned to their masters. Some of them were held in bondage for life. Many of them were sent here against their will. At the outbreak of the Revolution in 1776, more than 50,000 convicts were sent to the colonies as slave laborers. There were all sorts of sources of white slavery. They were the convicts, the urban poor, political prisoners, thieves, prostitutes, vagrants, prisoners of war, anyone designated undesirable by the British government. In the winter of 1650, 150 ragged Scottish prisoners of war arrived at Massachusetts Bay Colony, where they were sold as indentured laborers for 20 to 30 pounds each. And in colonial America, white and black slaves often bonded, according to NPR, which admits America's first slaves were white.
According to some African-American historians, there was no sign or little sign of racial tension between the English servants, which we reckon were slaves, and the African servants, who are also called servants. They were treated in much the same way for many decades. They complained together, they ran away together, they rebelled together.
George Washington himself had white slaves.
The beginning of your War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, there were ads in the Virginia Gazette for runaways, and I think that week there were something like 11 for white runaways and 3 for black runaways, and 2 of the 11 white runaways were being advertised by George Washington.
In early Virginia and Maryland, indentured servants, mostly English, Irish, and Scottish, did the same jobs that enslaved Africans would do in the 19th century, mostly tobacco farming. Conditions were so bad that 40 to 50% died before completing their terms. A 1671 report from Virginia Governor William Berkeley noted that the number of white slaves arriving vastly outnumbered black, quote, "We suppose there come in of servants about 1,500, of which most are English, few Scotch, and fewer Irish, and not above 2 or 3 ships of Negroes in 7 years. He then went on to note that in the early years of the colony, 80% of servants did not survive the first year. But it wasn't just the slaves that were multiracial. It was the slaveholders too. At slavery's peak in 1860, thousands of slaves were owned by Choctaws, Cherokees, Creeks, and Chickasaw Indians. As Alan Taylor writes in the book American Colonies, the Iroquois were particularly brutal in this regard. In colonial America, the Iroquois would often subject captives, the ones they did not enslave, to ritualistic slaughter and cannibalism in which captives would be tied to the stake, stabbed, then prodded with hot pokers. Quote, after the victim died, the women butchered his remains, cast them into cooking kettles, and served the stew to the entire village, so that all could be bound together in absorbing the captive's power. At the outbreak of the Civil War, one of South Carolina's wealthiest citizens was a planter and slaveholder named William Ellison. Census records show that at the outset of the Civil War, he owned 63 slaves, making him one of the biggest slave owners in the region. During the Civil War, he and his sons made substantial donations to the Confederate government, but what makes Allison remarkable is that he was a black man. In fact, he was a freed slave, whose former master had given him the business skills he needed to become a successful cotton gin manufacturer. He was such a prominent member of South Carolina society that the Charleston Mercury newspaper noted that he was a large slaveholder and is much respected throughout the district for his integrity and general good character. When the American journalist and social critic Frederick Law Olmsted visited Mississippi in the early 1860s, he described meeting a black man who told him there were, quote, many free Negroes all about this region. Some were very rich. He pointed out to me 3 plantations within 20 miles owned by colored men. They bought black folks, he said, and had servants of their own. They were very bad masters, very hard and cruel. If he had got to be sold, he would like best to have an American master buy him. The French, black Creole masters were very severe, and they whipped their N-words most to death. They whipped the flesh off them. In total, an estimated 3,000 blacks owned roughly 20,000 slaves in 1860, and in some cases, black slaveholders purchased relatives and spouses philanthropically, rescuing them from other slaveholders. But according to the black historian Carter Godwin Woodson, they often simply bought and sold slaves like white traders. He even described one case in which, quote, a Negro shoemaker in Charleston, South Carolina purchased his wife for $700, but on finding her hard to please, he sold her a few months thereafter for $750. The 1860 census offers some context that's left out of the history textbooks in this country. That year, there were 3,953,760 slaves and 487,970 total free colored population in the slave states in 1860. The reality is that a very small percentage of freed blacks and American Indians owned slaves, but the same is true for white Americans. In the 1860 census, at the very height of slavery, there were 393,975 slave owners in the U.S. out of a total population of over 31 million. That translates to about 1.2% of the population. The vast majority of American whites never owned any slaves. That's a critical point when in the context of modern calls for reparations. As a rule, black slaves in the American South had a life expectancy of 40 years and an annual mortality rate of 3 to 5%. Their odds of getting married, having children, attaining freedom were dramatically higher than slaves in the Caribbean, Brazil, East Africa, or, God forbid, Dahomey. Slaves in the Caribbean lived in barracks. In the South, they had cabins. There's no doubt that being a slave was a bad life, but if you were to be enslaved, it was better to be enslaved in the United States. The clearest metric on this is that the U.S. slaves' population kept growing after slave imports were banned in 1808. Unlike other parts of the Americas where deaths exceeded births, the U.S. ended up with nearly 4 million slaves in 1860, despite only 400,000 arrivals. Now, one reason for the better conditions could be incentives. With the import ban, slave owners' best source of slaves was high birth rates. Buying more was really expensive. Typical price for an able-bodied male field hand in New Orleans in 1860 was about $2,000. And if you track inflation based on the price of gold, that'd be over $100,000 today. For this reason, there are well-documented cases of slaveholders preferring to use less valuable, lower-class whites for dangerous tasks.